talking about the French Revolution, but yesterday I had a really busy night yesterday. I went to a party, but today we're going to talk about um, the French Revolution. So the French Revolution was a period of political and societal change in the country France that began with the Estates General of 1789 and it ended with the coup of 18 Brumaire on November 9th of 1799. So it ran for over 10 years. And many of the revolution's ideas are considered fundamental principles for a democratic democracy. And its values remain central to modern French political discourse, but it was also caused by a combination of social, political, and economic factors with the existing regime when it proved to be unable to manage. Now, financial crisis and the widespread social distress led to the convocation of the Estates General in May of 1789, in its first meeting since 1614. Now, the representatives of the Third Estate, um, let's turn this up here so anybody can hear me. Crap. Want to make sure you guys can hear me here. Um, Now, the representatives of the Third Estate broke away and they reconstituted themselves as a National Assembly in June. The storming of the Bastille in Paris on July 14th led to a series of radical measures by the Assembly, including the abolition of feudalism, state control over the Catholic Church in France, and issuing their own Declaration of the Rights of the Man and of the Citizen. Now, the next 3 years were dominated by a struggle for political control. King Louis XVI attempted flight to the Varennes in June of 1791 further discredited the monarchy and military defeats after the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars in April of 1792, and it led to the insurrection of August 10th of 1792. As a result, the monarchy was replaced by the French First Republic in French Revolution. As a result, the monarchy was replaced by the French First Republic in September, followed by the execution of Louis XVI himself in January 1793. Now, after another revolt in June of 1793, the Constitution was suspended and political power passed from the National Convention to the Public Safety. Dominated by radical Jacobins, led by Maximilian Robespierre, about 16,000 people were sentenced by the Revolutionary Tribunal, and they executed the Reign of Terror, which ended in July of 1794 with the Thermidorian reaction. Now weakened by external threats and internal opposition, the Committee of Public Safety was replaced in November of 1795 by the Directory. Now, its instability ended in 1799 with the coup of 18 Brumaire and the establishment of the consulate with Napoleon Bonaparte as the first consul. Now, there's a long-term effect and a short-term effect for the revolution and why it resulted. It resulted in a social economic. It resulted in a social and economic and financial and political crisis in the late 1780s. Combined with resistance to reform by the ruling elite and indecisive policy by Louis XVI and his ministers, the result was a crisis that the state was unable to manage and able to recover from. Between the years 1715 and 1789, the French Revolution grew from 21 to 28 million people, 20% of them who lived in towns or cities, Paris alone having over 600,000 inhabitants. Now, this was accompanied by a tripling the size of the middle class. And which comprised about 10% of the population by 1789. Despite increases in overall prosperity, its benefits were largely restricted to the renter and the mercantile classes, while the living standards fell for wage laborers and peasant farmers who rented their land. Economic recession from 1785, combined with bad harvests in 1787 and 1788, and it led to high unemployment and food prices, causing a financial and political crisis for France. While the state also experienced a debt crisis, the level Okay, so the state also experienced a debt crisis. The level of debt itself was not high compared with Britain, but a significant problem was that tax rates varied widely from one region to another, while they were also often different from the official amounts, and they were collected inconsistently. The complexity and the lack of accountability caused resentment among all taxpayers. Attempts to simplify the system were blocked by the regional parliaments, which approved financial policy. Now, the resultant impasse led to the calling of the States General of 1789, which became radicalized by the struggle for control of public finances. Now, Louis XVI was willing to consider reforms, but he often backed down when he was faced with opposition from conservative elements with the nobility. The Enlightenment critiques of social institutions were widely discussed among the educated French elite. At the same time, the American Revolution and the European revolts of the 1780s inspired public debate on issues such as patriotism, liberty, equality, and democracy. Now, these shaped the response of the educated public to the crisis, while scandals such as the affair of the diamond necklace fueled widespread anger at the court, nobility, and church officials. Now, France faced a series of budgetary crises during the 18th century as revenues failed to keep pace with any expenditure. Despite the solid economic growth, the use of tax primers meant that this was not reflected in the proportional growth in the state tax income. As the nobility and the church benefited from a variety of exemptions, the tax burden fell mainly on the lower class. Reform was difficult because new tax laws had to be registered with regional judicial bodies or parliaments that were able to block them. The king could impose laws by decree, but this risked an open conflict with the parliaments and the nobility and those subject to new laws. Now, France primarily used loans to fund the 1778 to 1783 Anglo-French War, and even after that war ended, the monarchy continued to borrow heavily, and by 1788, half of the state's revenue went on servicing its debt. In 1786, the French finance minister Calonne had proposed reforms including a universal land tax, the abolition of grain controls and internal tariffs, and the new provincial assemblies that were appointed by the king. The new taxes were rejected first by a hand-picked assembly of notables, dominated by the nobility, then by the parliaments when submitted by Calonne's successor Brienne, and the notables and parliaments argued that the proposed tax could only be approved by a States General, a representative body that last met in 1614. Now, the conflict between the crown and the parliaments became a national political crisis. Both sides issued a series of public statements, the government arguing that it was combating privilege, and the parliament defending the ancient rights of the nation. Public opinion was firmly on the side of the parliaments, and riots broke out in several towns. Brienne's attempts to raise new loans failed, and on August 8th of 1788, he announced that the king would summon an Estates General to convene the following May, and Brienne resigned and was replaced by Jacques Necker. In September of 1788, the Parliament of Paris ruled that the Estates General should convene in the same form as in 1614, meaning that the three estates would meet and vote separately, with votes counted by a state rather than by a head. As a result, the clergy and nobility could combine to outvote the third estate despite representing less than 5% of the population. Now, with the relaxation of censorship and laws against political clubs, a group of democratic nobles and middle class activists known as the Society of the 30 of the 30 launched a campaign for the doubling of the third estate representation and individual voting. The public debate sparked an average of 25 new political pamphlets that were published each week from going from September 25th of 1788. One of the most influential was written by Abby Sayers, titled "What is the Third Estate?" It denounced the privilege of the clergy and nobility and argued that the Third Estate represented the nation and it should sit alone as a national assembly. Activists as Jean Joseph Munier, Antoine Barnave, and Maximilien Robespierre organized these regional meetings on petitions and literature in support of these demands. In December, the king agreed to double the representation of the Third Estate, but it left the question of counting the votes for the Estates General to decide. The Catholic Church in France was wealthy, and they owned nearly 10% of all land, as well as receiving annual tips. However, 3/4 of the 303 clergy elected were parish priests. Many of the people that the 303 clergy elected were parish priests, and many of whom earned less than unskilled laborers and had more in common with their poor parishioners than with the bishops of the First Estate. Now, the Second Estate elected 322 deputies, which who represented about 400,000 men and women, and who owned about 25% of the land, and they collected seigneurial dues and rents from their tenants. Most delegates were town-dwelling members of the noble or traditional aristocracy. The courtiers and representatives of the noble, those who derived rank from judicial or administrative posts, were underrepresented. Now, here's a caricature. This is a caricature of the Third Estate carrying the First Estate clergy and the Second Estate nobility on its back. Of the 610 deputies of the Third Estate, about 2/3 held legal qualifications, and almost half were venal office holders. Less than 100 were Less than 100 were in trade or industry, and none of them were peasants or artisans. To assist delegates, each region completed a list of grievances known as the Cahiers de Doléances. Not sure if I said that right. Tax inequality and seigneurial duties, feudal payments owed to landowners, headed the grievances for the estate. On May 5th of 1789, the Estates General convened at Versailles, with Necker reiterating that each estate should decide separately how and when it would meet and vote in common with the other estates. On the following day, each estate was to separately verify the credentials of the representatives. The Third Estate, however, voted to invite the other estates to join them in verifying all the representatives of the States General in common, and to agree that votes should be counted by head. Negotiations continued until June 12th, when the Third Estate unilaterally began verifying its own members. So on the 17th, the Third Estate declared itself to the National Assembly of France, and that all existing taxes were illegal. By June 19th, they had been joined by more than 100 members. I was in Chicago yesterday. I went to Moxie. If you're ever in Chicago, if you're ever in downtown Chicago, hit up Moxie. Moxie's a very good place. It's a bar/hotel. Basically, I enjoyed my time there yesterday. By June 19th, they had been joined by more than 100 members of the clergy. Shaken by its challenge to his authority, the king agreed to a reform package. He would represent personally to the Estates General, um, and the Salvage estate attached was closed to prepare for the joint session. Now, but the members of the Estates General were not informed in any advance, but finding their meeting place closed the next day, and they took the so-called tennis court oath, undertaken not to disperse until a constitution had been agreed. At the royal session, Louis XVI announced a series of reforms and stated no new taxes or loans would be implemented without the consent of the States General. However, he then undermined this by restating this original demand for all three to sit and vote separately. The third estate refused to leave the hall and reiterated their oath not to disperse until a constitution had been agreed. Over the next days, more members of the clergy joined the National Assembly on June 27th, and faced with popular demonstrations and mutinies in his French guards, Louis XVI commanded the members of the First and Second Estates to join the Third in the National Assembly. And then you had the constitutional monarchy. Even the limited reforms the king had announced went too far for Marie Antoinette and Louis's younger brother, the Comte de Torres. On their advice, King Louis it's called Moxie, Moxy. There's a restaurant attached to it called Zombie Tacos. I didn't try the zombie tacos yesterday, but I was tempted. But I was trying to budget my money there. Um, I did get something yesterday called a honey ale beer. Um, Now, on King Louis's advice, they dismissed Necker again as chief minister on July 11th. On July 12th, the assembly went into a non-stop session following rumors that the king was planning to use the Swiss guards to force it to close down. The news brought crowds of protesters into the streets and soldiers of the elite guard, and they refused to disperse them. On July 14th, many of these soldiers joined a crowd attacking the Bastille, and you can see that here. This is the attacking and the storming of the Bastille in this picture. And this happened on July 14th of 1789. This is an iconic event of the Revolution and still commemorated each year as Bastille Day. And the Bastille is a royal fortress with large stores of arms and ammunition. Its governor, Bernard René Delaunay, surrendered after several hours of fighting that cost the lives of 83 people. Launay was taken to the Hotel de Ville, where he was killed and his head placed on a pike. That sounds like something I'm glad the Impaler did or would do. And paraded around the city. Although rumored to hold many prisoners, the Bastille only held seven: four forgers, a lunatic, a failed assassin, and a deviant nobleman. Nevertheless, it was a potent symbol for the ancient regime and was demolished in the following weeks. Bastille Day has become a French national holiday to this day. Alarmed by the prospect of losing control of the capital, Louis appointed Marquis de la Fay, commander of the National Guard, with Jean-Sylvain Bailly as head of the new administrative structure known as the Commune. On July 17th, King Louis visited Paris, accompanied by 100 deputies, where he was greeted by Bailly and accepted a tricolor cockade to a loud cheer. Now, however, it was clear power that had shifted from his court. He was welcomed as Louis XVI, father of the French and king of a free people. This short-lived unity that was enforced on the assembly by a common threat quickly dissipated. Deputies argued over constitutional forms, where civil authority rapidly deteriorated. On July 22nd, former French minister Joseph Poland and his son were lynched by a Paris mob, and neither Bailey nor Lafayette could prevent it. In rural areas, wild rumors and paranoia resulted in the formation of militia and an agrarian insurrection known as the Great Fear. The breakdown of law and order and frequent attacks on aristocratic property led much of the nobility to flee abroad, and these funded reactionary forces within France and urged foreign monarchs to back a counter revolution. Now, in response, the Assembly published the August decrees with abolished feudalism. Over 25% of the French farmland was subject to feudal dues, providing the nobility with most of their income. Now, these were now cancelled along with church tips, while their former tenants were supposed to pay them compensation, and collecting it proved impossible, and the obligation was annulled in 1793. Other decrees included equality before the law, opening public office to all, freedom of worship, and cancellation of special privileges that were held by provinces and towns. With the suspension of the 13 regional parliaments in November, the key institutional pillars of the old regime had been abolished in less than 4 months. And from its early stages, the revolution therefore displayed signs of its radical nature, and what remained unclear was the constitutional mechanism for turning intentions into practical applications. On July 9th, the National Assembly declared itself the Constituent Assembly, and it appointed a committee to draft the Constitution and Statement of Rights. 20 drafts were submitted, which were used by subcommittee to create a Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, with Mirabeau being the most prominent member. The Declaration was approved by the Assembly and published on August 26 as a statement of principle. Now, the Assembly now concentrated on the Constitution. Mounier and his monarchy supporters advocated a bicameral system with an upper house appointed by the king, who would also have the right to appoint ministers and veto any legislation that they tried to pass. On September 10th, the majority of the Assembly, led by Sieyès and Talleyrand, voted in favor of a single body, and the following day they approved a suspensive veto for the king, meaning that King Louis could delay implementation of the law, but he could not block it indefinitely. In October, the Assembly voted to restrict political rights, including voting rights to active citizens, and defined as a French male over the age of 25 who paid direct taxes equal to 3 days' labor. The remainder were designated passive citizens that was restricted to a right to vote, and they restricted to civil rights, a distinction opposed by a significant minority, including the Jacobean clubs. By mid-1790, the main elements of a constitutional monarchy were in place, although the Constitution was not accepted by Louis until 1791. Now, food shortages and the economy becoming worse, it caused frustration at the lack of progress and led to popular unrest in Paris. This came to a head in late September of 1789, when the Flanders Regiment arrived in Versailles to reinforce the royal bodyguard, and they were welcomed with a formal banquet, as was a common practice back then. The radical press described this as a gluttonous orgy and claimed the tricolor cockade had been abused, while the Assembly viewed the arrival as an attempt to intimidate them all. Now, on October 5th, crowds of women assembled outside the Hotel de Ville, agitated against high food prices and the shortages. These protests quickly turned political, and after seizing weapons stored at the Hotel de Ville, some 7,000 of them marched on Versailles, where they entered the Assembly to present their demands. They were followed to Versailles by 15,000 members of the National Guard under Lafayette, who was virtually a prisoner of his own troop. Now, when the National Guard arrived later that evening, Lafayette persuaded he persuaded King Louis that the safety of his family required their relocation to Paris. Next morning, some of the protesters broke into the royal apartments, searching for Marie Antoinette, who had escaped. They ransacked the palace, killing several guards. Order was eventually restored, and the royal family and assembly left for Paris, and they were escorted out by the National Guard. Now, King Louis had announced his acceptance of August decrees and the Declaration, and his official title changed from King of France to King of the French. Historian John McManners argues in 18th century France that the throne and altar were commonly spoken as if they had a close alliance. Doesn't mean that they did either. Their simultaneous collapse would one day provide the final proof of their independence. One suggestion is that after a century of persecution, some French Protestants actively supported an anti-Catholic regime, a resentment fueled by Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire. Jean Jacques Rousseau, who was considered a philosopher and founder of a philosophical founder and of the revolution, wrote it was manifestly contrary to the law of nature that a handful of people should gorge themselves with superfluities while the hungry multitude goes in the want of necessities. Now, the French caused a massive shift of power from the Catholic Church to the state, although the extent of religious belief has been questioned. Elimination of tolerance from religious minorities meant by 1789 being French also meant also that the French were also being Catholic. Now, the Church was the largest individual landowner in all of France, controlling 10% of the estates and levied tithes, effectively a 10% tax on income that was collected from peasant farmers in the form of crops. In return, it provided a minimal level of social support. Now, in this character, you can see the monks and the nuns enjoying their newfound freedom after a decree that was passed on February 16th of 1790. And you can see here up close the monks and the nuns celebrating their newfound freedom. The August decrees abolished tips, and on November 2nd, the Assembly confiscated all church property, the value of which was used to back a new paper currency known as the assignats. Now, in return, the state assumed responsibilities such as paying the clergy and caring for the poor, the sick, and the orphaned. On February 13th of 1790, religious orders and monasteries were dissolved, while the monks and nuns were encouraged to return to a private life. The civil constitution of the clergy on July 12, 1790, made them employees of the state, established a rate of pay, and it developed a system for electing priests and bishops. And Pope Pius VI and many French Catholics objected to this since it denied the authority of the Pope over the French Church. In October, 30 bishops wrote a declaration denouncing the law, further fueling opposition. And when clergy were required to swear loyalty to the civil constitution in November, it split the church between the 24th, who complied, and the majority who refused. This Brittany and the Bendy were only a few priests who took the oath, and the civilian population turned against the revolution. The result was a state-led persecution of refractory clergy, and many of whom were forced into exile, or they were either deported or executed. Now, the period from October of 1789 to into the spring of 1791, it's usually seen as one of the relative tranquility, when some of the most important legislative reforms were enacted. However, conflict over the source of legitimate authority was more apparent in the provinces where officers of the ancient regime had been swept away but not yet replaced by new structures. This was less obvious in Paris, since the National Guard made it the best policed city in Europe, but disorder in the provinces inevitably affected members of the Assembly. Now, centrists led by Sayas, Lafayette, Mirabeau, and Bailey created a majority by forging consensus with the monarchy, like Mounier, and independents included Adrien Duport, Barnaby, and Alexandre de Lameth. At one end of the political spectrum, reactionaries like Cazares and Maury denounced the revolution in all of its forms, with radicals like Maximilien Robespierre and at the other. He and Jean Paul Marat opposed the criteria for active citizens, gaining them substantial support among the Parisian proletariat, and many of whom had been disenfranchised by this measure. On July 14th of 1790, celebrations were held throughout France commemorating the fall of the Bastille, with participants swearing an oath of fidelity to the nation and the law and the king. The Fête de la Fédération in Paris was attended by the royal family, with Talleyrand performing a mass. Despite this show of unity, the assembly was increasingly divided, while external players like the Paris Commune and the National Guard competed over power, and one of the most significant was the Jacobean Club. Originally a forum for general debates, by August of 1790, it had over 150 members that were split into different factions. Now, the Assembly continued to develop new institutions. In September of 1790, the regional parliaments were abolished and their legal functions replaced by a new independent judiciary with jury trials for criminal cases. However, moderate deputies were uneasy at popular demands for universal suffrage, labor unions, and cheap bread. And over the winter of 1790 and 1791, they passed a series of measures intended to disarm popular radicalism. These included exclusion of poorer citizenships from the National Guard, limits on use of petitions and posters, and in June of 1791, Le Chapelier law suppressed trade guilds and any form of worker organization. Now, the traditional force for preserving law and order was the army, which was increasingly divided between officers who largely came from the nobility and ordinary soldiers. In August of 1790, the loyalist general Muley suppressed a serious mutiny at Nancy. Although congratulated by the Assembly, he was criticized by Jacobean radicals for the severity of his actions. Growing disorder meant many professional officers either left or became immigrants, further destabilizing the institution. Now, held in the Tuileries Palace under virtual house arrest, King Louis the 16th was urged by his brother and wife to reassert his independence by taking refuge with Boulay, who was based at the Montmedy with 10,000 soldiers that were considered loyal to the crown. The royal family left the palace in disguise on the night of June 20th of 1791, and late the next day, King Louis was recognized as he passed through Varennes, and he was arrested. And taken back to Paris. The attempted escape had a profound impact on public opinion, since it was clear that King Louis had been seeking refuge in Austria, and the Assembly now demanded oaths of loyalty to the regime and began preparing for war, while fear of spies and traitors became pervasive. Now, despite the calls to replace the monarchy with the republic, King Louis retained his position, but was generally regarded with acute suspicion and forced to swear allegiance to the Constitution. A new decree had stated retracting this oath, making war upon the nation, or permitting anyone to do so in the name, and it could be considered abdication. However, radicals led by Jacques Pierre Brissot had prepared a petition demanding his disposition. And on July 17th, an immense crowd gathered in the Champ de Mars to sign. And led by Lafayette, the National Guard was ordered to preserve public order and respond to a barrage of stones by firing into the crowd, which killed about 50 people. Now, after the flight to Varennes, the royal family are escorted back to Paris, and you can see that here. And you can see that the royal family is being escorted back. The massacre badly damaged the Lafayette's reputation, but the authorities responded by closing radical clubs and newspapers, while their leaders went into exile or hiding, including Marat. On August 27th, Emperor Leopold II and King Frederick William II of Prussia issued the Declaration of Polnitz, declaring their support for King Louis and hinting at an invasion of France on his behalf. Now, in reality, the meeting between Leopold and Frederick was primarily to discuss the partitions of Poland, and the declaration was intended to satisfy Comte d'Artois and other French immigrants, but the threat rallied popular support behind the regime. Now, based on a motion proposed by Robespierre, existing deputies were barred from elections held in September for the French Legislative Assembly. Although Robespierre was one of those excluded, his support in the clubs gave him a political base not available to Lafayette and Bailey, who resigned respectively as head of the National Guard and the Paris Commune. The new laws were gathered together in the 1791 Constitution and submitted to King Louis XVI, who pledged to defend it from enemies at home and abroad. On September 30th, the Constituent Assembly was dissolved, and the Legislative Assembly convened the next day. Now, the Legislative Assembly is often dismissed by historians as an ineffective body, compromised by divisions over the role of the monarchy, an issue exacerbated when King Louis attempted to prevent or reverse limitations on his powers. At the same time, restricting the vote to those who paid a minimal amount of tax disenfranchised a significant proportion of the 6 million Frenchmen over 25, while only 10% of those were able to vote actually did so. And finally, poor harvests and rising food prices led to unrest among the urban class, known as the sans culottes, who saw the new regime as failing to meet their demands for bread and work. Now, this meant that the new constitution was opposed by significant elements inside and outside the assembly. In itself, it split into three main groups. 264 members were affiliated with the Barnaby's Feuillants. The constitutional monarchs also had considered the revolution had gone too far, and while another 136 were Jacobean leftists who supported a republic led by Brissot, and usually referred to as Brissotins. Now, the remaining 345 belonged to Le Plain, a centrist faction who switched votes depending on the issue, and many of whom shared doubts as to whether Louis was committed to the revolution after he officially accepted the new constitution. One recorded response was Viva le Roi, C.M.S. de Bonpy, which means long live the king if he keeps his word. Although a minority of the assembly control of the key committees allowed the Brissotians to provoke King Louis into using his veto, they first managed to pass decrees confiscating the emigre property and threatening them with the death penalty if they didn't follow up with it. This was followed by measures against non-juring priests, whose opposition to the civil constitution led to a state of near civil war in southern France, which Barnaby tried to defuse by relaxing the more punitive provisions. On November 29th, the Assembly approved a decree giving refractory clergy 8 days to comply or face charges of conspiracy against the nation. And this act opposed even by Robespierre. When King Louis vetoed both, his opponents were able to portray him as opposed to reform in general. Now, Brissot accompanied this with a campaign for war against Austria and Prussia, often interpreted as a mixture of calculation and idealism. While exploiting popular anti-Austrianism, it reflected a genuine belief in exploiting the values of political liberty and popular sovereignty. Simultaneously, conservatives headed by Marie Antoinette also favored war, seeing it as a way to regain control of the military and restore royal authority. In December 1791, King Louis made a speech in the Assembly giving foreign powers a month to disband the Emigres or Price War, an act created with enthusiasm by supporters but suspicion from opponents. And here's the insurrection of August 10th of 1792. The thing right here, you can see that. Now, Barnaby's inability to build a consensus in the assembly resulted in the appointment of a new government, chiefly composed of Brissottians. On April 20th of 1782, the French Revolutionary War began when French armies attacked Austrian and Prussian forces along their border before suffering a series of disastrous defeats. In an effort to mobilize power support, the government ordered the popular support. The government ordered non-juring priests to swear an oath or be deported, and then dissolved the Constitutional Guard, and they replaced it with 20,000 federalists. King Louis agreed to disband the King Louis XVI agreed to disband the Guard, but vetoed the other two proposals, while Lafayette called on the assembly to suppress the clubs. Now, popular anger increased when details of the Brunswick Manifesto reached Paris on August 1st, threatening unforgettable vengeance should any oppose the Allies and seeking to restore the power of the monarchy. On the morning of August 10th, a combined force of the Paris National Guard and provincial Federalists attacked Tuileries, Paris, killing many of the Swiss guards protecting it. Now, King Louis and his family took refuge with the assembly, and shortly after 11 a.m., the deputies present voted to temporarily relieve the king, effectively suspending the monarchy. In late August, elections were held for the National Convention. Restrictions on the franchise meant the number of votes cast fell to 3.3 million versus the 4 million that they had in 1791. While intimidation was widespread, the Brissottians split between moderate Girondins that were led by Brissot and radical Montagnards headed by Robespierre. George Danton and Jean-Paul Marat. While loyalties consistently shifted, voting patterns suggest roughly 160 of the 749 deputies can generally be categorized as Girondists, with another 200 being Montagnards. The remainder were parts of a centrist faction known as La Plaine, headed by Bertrand Barrère, Pierre-Joseph Cambon, and Lazare Carnot. Now, right here is the execution of King Louis XVI. And you see the guillotine right here. That's where they set the axe down and it chopped off your head. Facing the empty pedestal where the statue of his grandfather, King Louis the 15th, previously stood. In the September massacres, between 1,100 and 1,600 prisoners held in Parisian jails were summarily executed, the vast majority being common criminals. As a response to the capture of Longwy and Verdun by Prussia, the perpetrators were largely National Guard members and Federalists on their way to the front. While responsibility is still disputed, the responsibility is still disputed. Even moderates express sympathy for the action, which soon spread to the provinces. One suggestion is that the killing stemmed from concern over growing lawlessness rather than political ideology. On September 20th, the French defeated the Prussians at the Battle of Valmy, in what was the first major victory by the Army of France during the Revolutionary Wars. Emboldened by this, on September 22nd, the convention replaced the monarchy with the French First Republic, and it introduced a new calendar, with 1792 becoming year one. The next few months were taken up by the trial of citoyen Louis Capet, which was formerly King Louis XVI. While evenly divided on the question of his guilt, members of the convention were increasingly influenced by radicals based within the Jacobean clubs and the Paris Commune. The Brunswick Manifesto made it easy to portray Louis as a threat to the revolution, especially when extracts from his personal correspondence showed him conspiring with the royalist exiles. On January 17, 1793, King Louis was sentenced to death for conspiracy against public liberty and general safety. 361 deputies were in favor, 288 against, while another 72 voted to execute him, subject to delaying conditions. The sentence was carried out on January 21st on the Place de la Revolution. Now the place, which is now called Place de la Concorde. Sorry, sometimes these French words get tongue-tied. Now, conservatives across Europe called for the destruction of the revolutionary France, and in February, the convention responded by declaring war on Britain and the Dutch Republic. Together with Austria and Prussia, these two countries were later joined by Spain, Portugal, Naples, and Tuscany in the War of the First Coalition. The Girondins had hoped war would unite the people behind the government and provide an excuse for rising prices and food shortages. Instead, they found themselves the target of popular anger, and in what proved a disastrous strategic move, many left Paris for the provinces. The first conscription measure, or levy en masse, on February 24th, had sparked riots in the capital. And they were already unsettled by changes imposed on the church, and March judicially conservative and royalist Bendy had rose in revolt on the 18th. General Charles Francois Dumouriez was defeated at near Winden and defected to the Austrians. Uprisings followed in Bordeaux, Lyon, Toulon, Marseille, and Caen. The Republic seemed on the verge of collapse. Now, the crisis led to the creation on April 6, 1793, of the Committee of Public Safety. Now, an executive committee accountable to the convention, the Girondins made a fatal political error by including Marat before the Revolutionary Tribunal for allegedly directing the September massacres. He was quickly acquitted, further isolating the Girondins from the sans-culottes. When Jacques Hubert had called for a popular revolt against the henchmen of Louis Capet on May 24th, he was arrested by the Commission of the 12. A Girondin-dominated tribunal set up to expose plots. In response to protests by the Commune, the Commission warned if by your insistent rebellions something befalls the representatives of the nation, Paris will be liberated. Now, growing discontent allowed the clubs to mobilize against the Girondins, backed by the Commune and elements of the National Guard. On May 31st, they attempted to seize power in a coup, although the coup on June 2nd, the convention was surrounded by a crowd of up to 8,000, demanding cheap bread, unemployment pay, and political reforms. The vote to the sans-culottes and the right to remove deputies at will. 10 members of the commission and another 29 members of the Girondin faction were arrested, and on June 10th, the Montagnards took over the Committee of Public Safety. Now, meanwhile, the committee led by Robespierre, closest ally, Louis Antoinette de Saint-Just, was tasked with preparing a new constitution, and completed in only 8 days. It was ratified by the convention on June 24th and contained radical reforms, including universal male suffrage. However, normal legal processes were suspended following the assassination of Marat on July 13th by the Girondist Charlotte Corday, which the Committee of Public Safety used as an excuse to take control. The 1793 Constitution was suspended indefinitely in October of that year. Now, key areas of focus for the new government included creating a new state ideology, economic regulation, and winning the war. They were helped by divisions among the internal opponents, while areas like the Bendy and Brittany wanted to restore the monarchy. Most supported the Republic, but opposed the regime in Paris. On August 17th, the convention voted a second levy en masse, despite initial problems in equipping and supplying such large numbers. By mid-October, the Republican forces had to retake Lyon, Marseille, and Bordeaux, while defeating coalition armies at Hansouch and Wattignies. The new class of military leaders included a young colonel named Napoleon Bonaparte, who was appointed commander of artillery at the siege of Toulon, and thanks to his friendship with Robespierre, his success in that role resulted in promotion to the Army of Italy in April 1794, and the beginning of his rise to military and political power. Although intended to bolster revolutionary fervor, the Reign of Terror rapidly degenerated into the settlement of personal grievances. At the end of July, the convention set price controls on a wide range of goods, with the death penalty for hoarders. Um, on September 9th, the revolutionary groups were established to enforce those controls, while the law suspects on September 17th approved the arrest of suspected enemies of freedom. This initiated what has become known as the Terror, and from September 1793 to July 1794, around 300,000 were arrested, but some 16,600 people were executed on charges of counter-revolutionary activity, while other 40,000 may have been summarily executed or died awaiting trial. These people were executed by the guillotine, and here it is again. The guillotine is the axe thing where they chop off your head, and you can see that thing here. This right here, this thing, this long there, here's the guillotine. That's where they had the axe on top, and then they would pull a string, and it would drop down, and it would chop up your head. And that was a brutal way to die. Price controls made farmers reluctant to sell their produce to Parisian markets, and by early September, the city was suffering acute food shortages. At the same time, the war increased public debt, which the assembly tried to finance by selling confiscated property. However, only a few would buy assets that might be repossessed by their former owners, and it caused a concern that could only be alleviated by military victory. This meant the financial position worsened as threats to the Republic increased, while printing assignats to deal with the deficit further increased inflation. On October 10th, the convention recognized the Committee of Public Safety as the supreme revolutionary government, and they suspended the Constitution until peace was achieved. In mid-October, Marie Antoinette was convicted of a long list of crimes and guillotined, and 2 weeks later, the Girondist leaders arrested in June were also executed along with Philippe Egalite. And the terror was not confined to Paris itself, but with over 2,000 people killed on Lyons after its recapture. At Cholet on October 17th, the Republican Army won a decisive victory over the Vendée rebels, and the survivors escaped into Brittany. A defeat at Le Mans on December 23rd ended the rebellion as a major threat, although the insurgency continued until 1796. The extent of the repression that followed has been debated by French historians since the mid-19th century, and between November 1793 and February 1794, over 4,000 were drowned in the Loire at Nantes under the supervision of John Baptist Carrier. The historian Renaud Sécher claims that as many as 117,000 died between 1793 and 1796. Although these numbers have been disputed, Francois Furet concludes that not only revealed massacre and destruction on an unprecedented scale, but a zeal so violent that it was bestowed as its legacy much of the region's identity. At the height of this terror, not even its supporters were immune from suspicion, leading to divisions within the Montagnard faction between the radical Herbertists and moderates led by Danton. And here's a picture of Danton. This is George Danton. And he was Robespierre's close friend and Montagnard leader, and he was executed on April 5th of 1794. Now Robespierre saw their dispute as destabilizing the regime, and as a deist, he objected to the anti-religious policies that were advocated by the atheist Hébert, who was arrested and executed on March 24th with 19 of his colleagues. And to retain the loyalty of the remaining Herbertists, Danton was arrested and executed on April 5th with Camille Desmoulins after a show trial that arguably did more damage to Robespierre than any other act in this period. Now, the law of the 22 Prairial on June 10th denied enemies of the people the right to defend themselves. Those arrested in the provinces were sent to Paris for judgment from March to July. Executions in Paris increased from five per day to 26 per day. Many Jacobians ridiculed the festival of the cult of the Supreme Being on June 8th, a lavish and expensive ceremony led by Robespierre, who was also accused of circulating claims that he was the second Messiah. Relaxation of price controls and rampant inflation caused increasing unrest among the sans-culottes, but the improved military situation reduced fears that the Republic would be in any danger, and fearing that their own survival depended on Robespierre's removal. On June 29th, three members of the Committee of Public Safety openly accused him of being a dictator. Robespierre responded by refusing to attend committee meetings, allowing his opponents to build a coalition against him. In a speech made to the convention on July 26, he claimed certain members were conspiring against the Republic, an almost certain death sentence if confirmed. When he refused to provide names, the session broke up in confusion. And that very evening, he repeated these claims at the Jacobins Club, where it was greeted with demands for the execution of the traitors. Now, fearing the consequences if they did not act first, his opponents attacked Robespierre and his allies in the convention next day. When Robespierre attempted to speak, his voice failed, one deeply crying, "The blood of Danton chokes him." After the convention authorized his arrest, he and his supporters took refuge in the Hotel de Ville, which was defended by elements of the National Guard. Now, other units loyal to the convention stormed the building that evening, and they detained Robespierre, who severely injured himself attempting suicide. He was executed on July 28th with 19 colleagues, including Saint Just and George Couthon, followed by 83 members of the committee. Of the commune, basically, the law of 22 Prairial was repealed. Any surviving Girondists reinstated as deputies, and the Jacobin Club was closed and banned for good. And there are various interpretations of the terror and the violence with which it was conducted. Pierrette argues that the intense ideological committee of the revolutionaries and their utopian goals had required the extermination of any opposition. A middle position suggests this violence was not inevitable, but the product of a series of complex internal events exacerbated and that was brought on by war. And here's the execution of Robespierre on July 28th, also, and which also marked the end of the Reign of Terror. Now, the bloodshed did not end with the death of Robespierre, but southern France saw a wave of revenge killings directed against alleged Jacobians. Republican officials and Protestants, although the victors of Thermidor asserted control over the committee or the commune by executing their leaders, some of those closely involved in the terror had retained their positions. This included Paul Barras, who was later chief executive of the French Directory, and Joseph Fouché, who was the director of the killings in Lyon, who served as minister of police of the Directory under the Directory and the Consulate and Empire. Despite his links to the Augustin Robespierre, military success in Italy had meant Bonaparte escaped censure. The December 1794 Treaty of Laudonnière ended the chouannerie in Western France by allowing freedom of worship and the return of non-juring priests. And this was accompanied by military success. In January 1795, French forces helped the Dutch patriots set up the Batavian Republic, securing their northern border. The war with Prussia was concluded in favor of France by the Peace of Bastille in April 1795, while Spain made peace shortly after. Now, however, the Republic still faced a crisis at home. Food shortages arising from the poor 1794 harvest were exacerbated in northern France by the need to supply the army in Flanders, while the winter was the worst since 1709. By April 1795, people were starving to death, and the assignat was worth only 8% of its face value. In desperation, the Parisian poor rose again. They were quickly dispersed, and the main impact was another round of arrests, while Jacobian prisoners in Lyon were summarily executed. And here's a picture of Paul Barras. He was a former viscount and Montagnard, who took part in the Thermidorian reaction, and later he would head up the French Directory. The committee drafted the Constitution of the Year 3, approved by a plebiscite on September 23rd of 1795, and it was put into place on September 27th of that year. Largely designed by Pierre Dunois and Boise D. Ingalls, it established a bicameral legislature. Excuse me. Intended to slow down the legislative process, ending the wild swings of policy under the previous unicameral systems. The Council of the 500 was responsible for drafting legislation, which was reviewed and approved by the Council of Ancients, an upper house containing 250 men who were above the age of 40. Executive power was in the hands of 5 directors selected by the Council of Ancients from a list provided by the lower house within a 5-year mandate. Now, deputies were chosen by indirect election, a total franchise of around 5 million people voting, and primaries for 30,000 electors, or only 0.6% of the population. Since they were also subject to stringent property qualification, it guaranteed the return of conservative or moderate deputies. In addition, rather than dissolving the previous legislature as in 1791 and 1792, the so-called law of the two-thirds ruled only 150 new deputies would be elected each year. The remaining 600 conventionals kept their seats, a move intended to ensure stability. Okay, so the Jacobean sympathizers viewed the French Directory as a betrayal of the revolution, while Bonapartists later justified Napoleon's coup by emphasizing its corruption. The regime also faced internal unrest, a weak economy, and an expensive war. While the Council of 500 could block the legislation at will, and since the directors had no power to call new elections, the only way to break a deadlock was to rule by decree or use any force. Now, as a result, the Directory was characterized by chronic violence and ambivalent forms of justice, and the repeated recourse to heavily handed repression. Now here are troops under Napoleon. Troops under Napoleon fire on the royalist insurgents in Paris on October 5th of 1795. And you can get close up here and you can see that. Yep. Now, the retention of the conventionals ensured that Thermidorians held a majority in the legislature and 3 of the 5 directors, but they were increasingly challenged by the right. On October 5th, convention troops led by Napoleon put down a royalist rising in Paris. When the first legislative elections were held 2 weeks later, over 100 of the 150 new deputies were royalists of some sort. Now, the power of the Parisian sans culottes had been broken by the suppression of the May 1795 revolt, and there was relieved of pressure from below. The Jacobean clubs became supporters of the Directory, largely to prevent the restoration of the monarchy. Now, the removal of price controls and a collapse in the value of the assignat led to inflation and soaring food prices. By April 1796, over 500,000 parishioners of the Parisians were unemployed, resulting in the May insurrection known as the Conspiracy of the Equals. Led by the revolutionary Francois Noel Babeuf, I'm not sure if I'm saying that name right either. Their demands included immediate implementation of the 1793 Constitution and a more equitable distribution of wealth. Despite support from sections of the military, the revolt was easily crushed, while Babeuf and other leaders were executed. Nevertheless, by 1799, the economy had been stabilized and important reforms made, allowing the steady expansion of French industry, and many of these remained in place for much of the 19th century. Prior to 1797, the 3 of the 5 directors were firmly Republican. Barras, Rebellier, Lepeau, and Jean-Francois Rubel, as were around about 40% of the legislature. The same percentage were broadly centrist or unaffiliated, along with 2 directors, Etienne Francois Latourneur and Lazare Carnot. Although only 20% were committed royalists, many centrists supported the restoration of the exiled King Louis the 18th, and the belief that this would bring peace to the country. The elections. The elections of May of 1797 resulted in a significant gains for the right, while royalist Jean Charles Pichegru had elected president of the Council of 500, and Barthélemy appointed a director. And this picture is supposed to show Napoleon Bonaparte. I can't really see him, but obviously Napoleon Bonaparte in the Council of the 500 during 18 Brumaire on November 9th of 1799. With royalists apparently on the verge of power, the Republicans attempted a preemptive coup on September 4th. Using troops from Napoleon's army of Italy under Pierre Augereau, the Council of 500 was forced to approve the arrest of Barthélemy, Pichegru, and Carnot. The elections were annulled. 63 leading royalists deported to French Guyana, and laws were passed against immigrants, royalists, and ultra-Jacobians. The removal of his conservative opponents opened the way for direct conflict between Barras and those on the left. Now, fighting continued despite general war weariness, and the 1798 elections resulted in a resurgence in Jacobean strength. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in July of 1798 confirmed European fears of French expansion, and the War of the Second Coalition began in November. Without a majority in the legislature, the directors relied on the army to reinforce decrees and extract revenues from conquered territories. Generals like Napoleon and Barthélemy Catherine Joubert became central to the political process, while both the army and directory became notorious for their corruption. It has been suggested in the directory collapse because by 1799 many preferred the uncertainties of the authoritarian rule to the continuing ambiguities of the parliamentary politics. The architect of its end was Sieyès, who when asked what he had done during the terror allegedly answered, "I survived." Nominated to the directory, his first action was to remove Barras with the help of allies including Talleyrand and Napoleon's brother Lucien, president of the Council of the 500. On November 9th of 1799, the coup of 18 Brumaire replaced the 5 directors of the French consulate, which consisted of 3 members, Napoleon, Sieyès, and Roger Ducos. Most historians consider this to be the end of the French Revolution. The role of ideology in the French Revolution is controversial, with Jonathan Israel stating that the radical enlightenment was the primary driving force behind the revolution. Cobbin, however, argues the actions of the revolutionaries were most often prescribed by the need to find radical, practical solutions to immediate problems using the resources at hand, and not by preconceived theories. The identification of ideologies is complicated by the profusion of revolutionary clubs, factions, and publications, absence of formal political parties, and the individual flexibility in the face of changing circumstances. In addition, although the Declaration of the Rights of Man was fundamental document for all revolutionary factions, its interpretation varied widely. Now, while all the revolutionaries professed their devotion to liberty and principle, it appeared to mean whatever those in power wanted. For example, the liberties specified in the Rights of Man were limited by law when they might cause harm to others or be abused. And prior to 1792, Jacobins and others frequently opposed press restrictions on the grounds, and these violated a basic right. However, the Radical National Convention passed laws in September of 1793 and by July of 1794 imposing the death penalty for offenses such as disparaging the National Convention and misleading the public opinion. Now, while revolutionaries also endorsed the principle of equality, few advocated equality of wealth, since property was also viewed as a right. The National Assembly opposed equal political rights for women, while also the abolition of slavery in the colonies was delayed until February 1794 because it conflicted with the property rights of slave owners, and many feared it would disrupt trade. The political equality for male citizens was another divisive issue, with the 1791 Constitution limiting the right to vote and stand for office. Only from you had to be 25 and older to either vote or run for office in French. Now, this restriction was opposed by many activists, including Robespierre, the Jacobins, and the Cordeliers. Now, the principle that sovereignty resided in the nation was a key concept of the revolution. However, Israel argues that this obscures ideological differences over whether the will of the nation was best expressed through representative assemblies and constitutions, or direct action by revolutionary crowds and popular assemblies such as the sections of the Paris Commune. Many considered constitutional monarchy as incompatible with the principle of popular sovereignty. Prior to 1792, there was a strong bloc with an ideological commitment to such a system based on the writings of Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Montesquieu, and Voltaire. Now, Israel argues the nationalization of church property and the establishment of the constitutional church reflected an ideological commitment to secularism and the determination to undermine a bastion of old regime privilege. While Coban agrees that the constitutional church was motivated by ideology. He sees its origins in the anti-clericalism of Voltaire and other Enlightenment figures. Now, Jacobins were hostile to formal political parties and factions which they saw as a threat to national unity and the general will at large, with political virtue and love of country as key elements of their ideology. They viewed the ideal revolutionary as selfless, sincere, free of political ambition, and devoted to the nation. The disputes leading to the departure first of the feudalists, then later the Girondists, were conducted in terms of the relative political virtue and patriotism of the disputants. In December of 1793, all members of the Jacobin clubs were subject to a purifying scrutiny to determine whether they were men of virtue. Now, the revolution initiated a series of conflicts that began in 1792 and ended with Napoleon's defeat of Waterloo in 1815. In its early stages, this seemed unlikely. The 1791 Constitution specifically had disavowed war for the purpose of conquest, and although traditional tensions between France and Austria reemerged in the 1780s, Emperor Joseph II cautiously welcomed the reforms. Austria was at war with the Ottomans, as were the Russians, and while both were negotiating with Prussia over partitioning Poland, most importantly, Britain preferred peace, and as Emperor Leopold II stated after the Declaration of Pillnitz, without England there is no case. And here's the Battle of Valmy by Horace Vernet. In 1826, French victory at the Battle of Valmy on September 20th of 1792 validated the revolutionary idea of armies composed of citizens. In late 1791, factions within the assembly came to see war as a way to unite the country and secure the revolution by eliminating hostile forces in its border and establishing its natural frontiers. France declared war on Austria in April of 1792 and issued the first conscription orders, with recruits serving for 12 months. By the time peace finally came in 1815, the conflict had involved every major European power as well as the United States, and they redrawn the map of Europe and expanded into the Americas, the Middle East, and the Indian Ocean. From 1701 to 1801, the population of Europe grew from 118 people to 187 million people, and it combined with the new mass production techniques. This allowed belligerents to support large armies requiring the mobilization of national resources. It was a different kind of war fought by nations rather than kings, intended to destroy their opponent's ability to resist, but also to implement deep-ranging social change. While all wars are political to some degree, this period was remarkable for the emphasis that was placed on reshaping boundaries and the creation of entirely new European states. In April 1792, French armies invaded the Austrian Netherlands, but suffered a series of setbacks before victory over an Austrian-Prussian army at Valmy in September. After defeating a second Austrian army at Jemappes on November 6, they occupied the Netherlands, the areas of the Rhineland, Nice, and Savoy. Emboldened by this success, in February 1793, France declared war on the Dutch Republic, Spain, Britain, beginning the War of the First Coalition. However, the expiration of the 12-month term for the 1792 recruits had forced the French to relinquish their conquests. Now, in August, new conscription measures were passed, and by May of 1794, the French army had between 750,000 and 800,000 men. Despite high rates of desertion, this was large enough to manage multiple internal and external threats. For comparison, the combined Prussian army was less than 90,000. Now, by February of 1795, France had annexed the Austrian Netherlands. They established their frontier on the left bank of the Rhine, and they replaced the Dutch Republic with the Batavian Republic, a satellite state. Now, these victories led to the collapse of the anti-French coalition. Prussia made peace in April 1795, followed soon after by Spain, leaving Britain and Austria as the only major powers that were still in power, and they were still in the war. In October of 1797, a series of defeats by Bonaparte in Italy led Austria to agree to the Treaty of Campo Formio, in which they formally ceded the Netherlands and recognized the Cisalpine Republic. Fighting continued for mainly two reasons. First, the French state finances had come to rely on indemnities levied on their defeated opponents. Second, the armies were primarily loyal to their generals, for whom the wealth achieved by victory and the status it conferred became objectives to themselves. Leading soldiers like Lazare Hoche, Jean-Charles Pichegru, and Lazare Carnot wielded significant political influence and often set policy. Campo Formio was approved by Bonaparte, not the Directory, which strongly objected to terms it considered to be too lenient. Now, despite these concerns, the Directory never developed a realistic peace program, fearing the destabilizing effects of peace and the consequent mobilization of hundreds of thousands of young men. As long as the generals and the armies stayed away from Paris, they were happy to allow them to continue fighting. A key factor behind sanctioning Bonaparte's invasion of Europe, this resulted in aggressive and opportunistic policies leading to the War of the Second Coalition in November 1798. In 1789, the most populous French colonies were Saint Domingue, today, which is Haiti, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and the Ile Bourbon Reunion, and the Ile de la France. These colonies produced commodities such as sugar, coffee, and cotton for the exclusive export to France. And there were about 700,000 slaves in the colonies, of which about 500,000 were in Saint Domingue. The colonial products accounted for about a third of France's exports. In February of 1788, the Society of the Friends of the Blacks were formed in France with the aim of abolishing slavery in the empire. In August of 1789, the colonial slave owners and the merchants formed the rival Club de Mosaic to represent their interest. When the Constituent Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in August of 1789, delegates representing the colonial landowners successfully argued that the principle should not apply in the colonies, as they would bring economic ruin and disrupt any trade that they could muster. The colonial landowners also gained control of the colonial committee of the assembly, from where they exerted a powerful influence against abolition. Now, people of color, meaning black people, had also faced social and legal discrimination in mainland France and its colonies, including a bar on their access to professions such as law, medicine, and pharmacy. In 1789 to 1790, a delegation of free colors led by Vincent Ogé and Julian Raymond unsuccessfully lobbied the assembly to end discrimination against this group. Ogé left for Saint Domingue, where an uprising against white landowners broke out in October 1790. This revolt failed, and Ogé was killed. In May of 1791, the National Assembly granted full political rights to coloreds born of two free parents, but left the right of freed slaves to be determined by the colonial assemblies. The assemblies refused to implement the decree, and fighting broke out between the colored population of Saint Domingue and white colonists, each side recruiting slaves to their forces. A major slave revolt would follow up in August. In March of 1792, the Legislative Assembly responded to the revolt by granting citizenship to all free coloreds and sending two commissioners. Leger, Felicet Sonothorax, and Etienne Polverel, and 6,000 troops to they were sent to Saint Domingue to enforce the decree. On arrival in September, the commissioners announced that slavery would remain in force. Over 72,000 slaves were still on revolt, and mostly that was up in the north. Brissot and his supporters envisioned an eventual abolition of slavery, but their immediate concern was securing trade and the support of merchants for the Revolutionary War. After Brissot's fall, the new Constitution of June 1793 included a new Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, but excluded the colonies from its provisions. In any event, the new Constitution was suspended until France was at peace. In early 1793, the Royalist planters from Guadalupe and Saint Domingue formed an alliance with Britain. The Spanish supported insurgent slaves led by Jean-Francis Papillon and George Biassou. In the north of the Saint Domingue, while planters loyal to the Republic sent representatives to Paris to convince the Jacobean-controlled convention that those calling for the abolition of slavery were British agents and supporters of Brissot, hoping to disrupt that trade. In June, the commissioners of Saint Domingue freed about 10,000 slaves fighting for the Republic. As the Royalists and their British and Spanish supporters were also offering freedom for slaves willing to fight for their cause, the commissioners outbid them by abolishing slavery in the North in August and throughout the colony in October. Representatives were sent to Paris to gain the approval of the convention for this decision. Now, the convention voted for the abolition of slavery in the colonies on February 4th of 1794, and they decreed that all residents in the colonies had the full rights of French citizens, irrespective of any color. An army of about 1,000 sans culottes, led by slaves, and eventually numbered about 11,000, capturing Guadalupe and other smaller islands. Abolition was also proclaimed on Guyana. Martinique remained under British occupation, while colonial landowners in Reunion and Mascarenas had repulsed the Republicans. Black armies drove the Spanish out of Saint Domingue in 1795, and the British troops withdrew in 1798. Now, in the Republican-controlled areas from 1793 to 1799, freed slaves were required to work on their former plantations or for their former masters if they were in domestic service. They were paid a wage and gained property rights. Black and colored generals were effectively in control of large areas of Guadalupe and Saint Domingue, including Toussaint Louverture in the north of Saint Domingue and the Andre Rigaud in the south. Historian Frederick Regent states that the restrictions on the freedom of employment and movement of former slaves meant that only whites, persons of color already freed before the decree, and former slaves in the army or warships really had only benefited from the general emancipation. Newspapers and pamphlets played a central role in stimulating and defining the revolution. Prior to 1789, there had been a small number of heavily censored newspapers that needed a royal license to operate, but the Estates General created an enormous demand for news, and over 130 newspapers appeared by the end of the war. Among the most significant were Marat's El Ami du Peuple and the Revolution de Paris. Now, over the next decade, more than 2,000 newspapers were founded, 500 in Paris alone, and most lasted only a matter of weeks, but they became the main communication medium, combined with the very large pamphlet literature. Now, newspapers were read aloud in taverns and clubs and circulated hand to hand, and there was widespread assumption that writing was a vocation, not a business, and the role of the press was the advancement of civic republicanism. In 1783, the radicals were most active by initially the Loyalists flooded the country with their publication El Ami du Roi, friends of the king, until they were suppressed. And to illustrate the differences between the new republic and the old regime, the leaders needed to implement a new set of symbols to be celebrated instead of the old religious and monarchical symbols. To this end, symbols were borrowed from historic cultures and redefined, while those of the old regime were either destroyed or reattributed acceptable characteristics. And these revised symbols were used to instill in the public a new sense of tradition and reverence for the Enlightenment and the Republic. Marseillaise became the national anthem of France. The song was written and composed in 1792 by Claude Joseph Rigaud Delisle and was originally titled Chant de Girl. The French National Convention adopted it as the first Republic's anthem in 1795. It acquired its nickname after being sung in Paris by volunteers from Marseille marching on the capital. The song is the first example of the European march and anthemic style, while the evocative melody and the lyrics led to its widespread use as a song of revolution and incorporation into many pieces of classical and popular music. The guillotine remains the principal symbol of the terror in the French Revolution, invented by position during the Revolution as a quicker and more efficient and more distinctive form of execution rather than hanging. The guillotine became a part of a popular culture and historic memory. It was celebrated on the left as the People's Avenger, for example, in the Revolutionary Song, and cursed as the symbol of the terror by the right. Its operation became a popular entertainment that attracted great crowds of spectators. Vendors sold programs listing the names of those scheduled to die. Many people came day after day, and they vied for the best locations from which to observe the proceedings. Knitting women formed the cadre of hardcore regulars, inciting the crowd. Parents often brought their children, and by the end of the terror, the crowds had thinned drastically. Repetition had staled even this most grisly of entertainments, and audiences grew bored. Cockades were widely worn by revolutionaries beginning in 1789. They pinned the blue and red cockade of Paris onto the white cockade of the ancient regime. Camille Desmoulins had asked his followers to wear green cockades on July 12th of 1799. The Paris militia formed on July 13th. They adopted a blue and red cockade. Blue and red are the traditional colors of Paris, and they are used on the city's coat of arms. Cockades with various color schemes were used during the storming of the Bastille on July 14th. The Liberty Cap, also known as the Pregarian Cap or Pileus, is a brimless felt cap that is conical in shape with the tip pulled forward. It reflects the Roman republicanism and liberty, alluding to the Roman ritual of manumission, in which a freed slave receives the bonnet as a symbol of his newfound liberty. In August and October of 1793, the revolutionary authorities had ordered the exhumation of the remains of members of the royal family that was buried at the Saint Denis Basilica, which has served as the principal burial site of the French royalty since the early Middle Ages. The remains were buried in mass graves, and these acts reflected revolutionary hostility toward royal authority and the symbolic power of dynastic memory. Even though they were deprived of political rights by the ancient regime, the revolution initially allowed women to participate in activities, although only to a limited degree. Activists included Girondins like Olympie de Gouges, who was the author of the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, and Charlotte Corday, killer of Marat. Others like Thuragny de Maricourt, Pauline Leon, and the Society of the Revolutionary Republican Women supported the Jacobians, staged demonstrations in the National Assembly, and they took part in the October 1789 March to Versailles. Despite this, the 1791 and the 1793 constitutions denied them political rights and any democratic citizenship. Now, in 1793, the Society of Revolutionary Republican Women campaigned for strict price controls on bread and a law that would compel all women to wear the tricolor cockade. Although both demands were successful, in October, the male-dominated Jacobians, who often then controlled the government, denounced the society as dangerous, rabble-rousers, and they made all women's clubs and associations illegal. Organized women were permanently shut out of the French Revolution after October 30th of 1793. At this very same time, especially in the provinces, women played a prominent role in resisting social changes that were introduced by the revolution. This was particularly so in terms of the reduced role of the Catholic Church for those living in rural areas. Closing the churches meant a loss of normality, and this sparked a counter-revolutionary movement that was led by women while supporting other political and social changes. And they opposed this dissolution of the Catholic Church and the revolutionary cults like the cult of the Supreme Being. Owen Houghton argues some wanted to protect the church from heretical changes that were enforced by revolutionaries and viewing themselves as defenders of the faith. Olympe de Gouges was an author whose publications emphasized that while women and men were different, this should not prevent equality under the law. In her Declaration of the Rights of Women and of the Female Citizen, she insisted women deserved rights too, especially in areas concerning them directly, such as divorce and recognition of illegitimate children. Along with other Girondists, she was executed in November of 1793 during the Terror. And this is what she looked like. This is a photo of Olympe de Gouges, the Girondist author of the Declaration of the Rights of Women and of the Female Citizen, who was executed in November 1793. Madame Roland, known as Manon or Marie Roland, was another important female activist whose political focus was not specifically women but other aspects of the government. A Girondist, her personal letters to leaders of the revolution influenced policy. In addition, she often hosted political gatherings of the Brissotins, a political group which allowed women to join. She too was executed in November 1793. Now, the revolution abolished many economic constraints imposed by the ancient regime, including church tithes and feudal dues. Although tenants often paid higher rents and taxes, all church lands were nationalized, along with those owned by royal exiles, which were used to back paper currency known as assignats, and the feudal guide system was eliminated. It also abolished the highly efficient system of tax farming, whereby private individuals would collect taxes for a hefty fee. The government seized the foundations that had been set up by starting in the 13th century to provide an annual stream of revenue for hospitals, poor relief, and education. The state sold the lands, but typically local authorities did not replace the funding, and so most of the nation's charitable and school systems were massively disrupted. Between 1790 and 1796, the industrial and agricultural output dropped, foreign trade plunged, and prices soared, forcing the government to finance expenditure by issuing ever-increasing quantities assignats. When this results in escaping inflation or escalating inflation, the response was to impose price controls and persecute private speculators and the traders, creating a black market. Between 1789 and 1793, the annual deficit increased from 10% to 64% of the gross national domestic product, while the annual inflation reached 3,500 after a poor harvest in 1794 and the removal of price controls. The assignats were withdrawn in 1796, but inflation continued until the introduction of the gold-based franc germinal in 1803. Now, the French Revolution had a major impact on Western history by ending feudalism in France and creating a path for advances in individual freedoms throughout Europe. The revolution presented the most significant challenge to political absolutism up to that point in history and spread democratic ideals throughout Europe and ultimately the world. Its impact on French nationalism was profound, while also stimulating national movements throughout Europe. Some modern historians argue that the concept of the nation state was a direct consequence of the revolution. As such, the revolution is often seen as marking the start of modernity and the modern period. Yes, audio, we know you're gay. We don't need to know about it. We don't need to know about you sucking dick we don't need to know about you sucking dick at all. The long-term impact on France was profound, shaping politics, society, religion, and ideals, and polarizing politics for more than a century. Historian Francois Allard writes, from the social point, no, we know you're gay. We know you're gay, audio. We don't care about it. From the societal point of view, the revolution consisted in the suppression of what was called the feudal system, the emancipation of the individual, a greater division of landed property, the abolition of the privileges of noble birth, the establishment of equality, the simplification of life, and the French Revolution differed from other revolutions in being not merely national, for it aimed at benefiting all humanity. The revolution permanently crippled the power of the aristocracy and drained the wealth of the church. Although the two institutions survived, Hansen suggests the French underwent a fundamental transformation in self-identity, evidenced by the elimination of privileges and the replacement by intrinsic human rights. After the collapse of the First French Empire in 1815, the French public lost many of the rights and privileges earned since the Revolution. But remember the participatory politics that characterized the period. According to Paul Hansen, revolution became a tradition and republicanism an enduring option. Now, the revolution meant an end to arbitrary royal rule and held out the promise of rule by law under a constitutional order. Now, Napoleon as emperor set up by a constitutional system and the restored Bourbons. They were forced to retain one. After the abdication of Napoleon III in 1871, the French Third Republic was launched with a deep commitment to upholding the ideals of the revolution. The Vichy regime, which ran from 1940 to 1944, which was like during World War II, they tried to undo the revolutionary heritage but retained the republic. However, there were no efforts by the Bourbons, Vichy, or any other government to restore the privileges that had been stripped away from the nobility in 1789. But France permanently became a society of equals under the law. Agriculture was transformed by the Revolution. With the breakup of a large estate that was controlled by the church and the nobility, and they worked by hired hands, the rural part of France became more a land of small independent firms. The harvest tax were ended, such as the tithe and the seigneurial dues. The primogeniture was ended by both for nobles and peasants, and thereby weakening the family patriarch, and that led to a fall in the birth rate, since all children had a share in the family property. Coban argues the revolution bequeathed to the nation a ruling class of landowners. Now, agriculture was transformed by the revolution. So economic historians are divided on the economic impact of the revolution. One suggests the resulting fragmentation of agriculture holdings had a significant negative impact on the early years of the 19th century. Then became positive in the second half of the century because it facilitated the rise in human capital investments. Others argue the redistribution of land had an immediate positive impact on agricultural productivity before the scale of these gains gradually declined over the course of the 19th century. In the city, entrepreneurship on a small scale flourished as restrictive monopolies, privileges, barriers, rules, taxes, and guilds gave way. However, the British blockade virtually ended overseas and colonial trade, hurting the cities and their supply chains. Overall, the revolution did not greatly change the French business system and probably helped freeze in place the horizons of the small business owner. The typical businessman owned a small store, a mill, or some type of shop with family help and a few paid employees. Large-scale industry was less common than in other industrialized nations. Now, historians often see the impact of the revolution as through the institutions and ideas that was exported by Napoleon. Economic historian Dan Bogart, Mauricio Drelekman, Oscar Gelderblom, and Jean Laurent Rosenthal describe Napoleon's codified laws, the French Revolution's most significant export. According to Duran, the French Revolution had a long-term effect in Europe. They suggested all areas that were occupied by he suggested that the areas that were occupied by the French and that underwent radical institutional reform experienced more rapid urbanization and economic growth, especially after the year 1850. And there was no evidence of a negative effect on the French invasion at all. The revolution sparked an intense debate in Britain. The revolution controversy was a pamphlet war that was set off by the publication of a discourse on the love of our country, a speech that was given by Richard Price to the Revolution Society on November 4th of 1789. Supporting the French Revolution, Edmund Burke responded in November of 1790 with his own pamphlet, Reflections on the Revolution in France. Attacking the French Revolution as a threat to the aristocracy of all countries, William Cox opposed Price's premise that one's country is principles and people, and not the state itself. Now, conversely, two seminal political pieces of political history were written in Price's favor, supporting the general right of the French people to replace their state. One of the first of these pamphlets into French was A Vindication of the Rights of Men by Mary Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft's title was echoed by Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, published a few months later. In 1792, Christopher Wyville published a defense of Dr. Price and the Reformers of England, a plea for reform and moderation. And this exchange of ideas has been described as one of the great political debates in British history. In Ireland, the effect was to transform what had been an attempt by Protestant settlers to gain some anatomy into a mass movement led by the Society of United Irishmen, involving the Catholics and Protestants. It stimulated the demand for further reform throughout Ireland, especially in Ulster, and led to the Irish Rebellion of 1798, which was brutally suppressed by government troops. The German reaction to the revolution swung from the favorable to antagonistic. At first, it brought liberal and democratic ideas and the end of the guild serfdom and the Irish ghetto. It brought economic freedoms and the agrarian and legal reform. Above all, the antagonism helped stimulate and shape German nationalism. France would eventually invade Switzerland and turn it into the Helvetic Republic, which happened from 1798 to 1803. A French puppet state. French interference with localism and traditions was deeply resented in Switzerland, although some reforms took hold and survived the later period of restoration. France invaded and occupied the region now known as Belgium between 1794 and 1814. The new government enforced reforms, incorporating the region into France. Resistance was strong in every sector, as Belgian nationalism emerged to oppose French rule. The French legal system, however, was adopted with its equal legal rights and abolition of class and distinctions. Now, the Kingdom of Denmark adopted liberalizing reforms in line with those of the French Revolution. Reform was gradual, and the regime itself carried out agrarian reforms, and this had the effect. So this had the effect of awakening absolutism by creating the class of independent peasant holders. Most of the initiative came from well-organized liberals who directed, or Democrats as I like to call them, who directed political change in the first half of the 19th century. The Constitution of Norway of 1814 was inspired by the French Revolution and was considered to be one of the most democratic constitutions at that time. Now, initially, most people in the province of Quebec were favorable toward the revolutionaries' aims. The revolution took place against the background of an ongoing campaign for constitutional reform in the colony by loyalist immigrants from the United States. Public opinion began to shift against the revolution after the fight to Varennes, and further soured after the September massacres and the subsequent execution of Louis XVI. French migration to Canada experienced a substantial decline during and after the Revolution. Only a limited number of artisans, professionals, and religious emigres were allowed to settle in the region during this period. Most emigres settled in Montreal or Quebec City, but the influx of religious immigrants also revitalized the local Catholic Church with exiled priests, establishing a number of parishes across the Canadas. In the United States, the French Revolution deeply polarized American politics, and the polarization led to the creation of the first party system. In 1793, as war broke out in Europe, the Democratic Republican Party, led by the former American Minister to France, Thomas Jefferson, favored revolutionary France and appointed to the 1778 treaty that was still in effect. George Washington and his unanimous cabinet, including Jefferson, decided that the treaty did not bind the United States to enter that war. Washington proclaimed neutrality instead. And that is the end of our video. If you like the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, Rusty the King. You can also check out my other channel, called RBW King, if you want more videos like this. There's a guy on this channel. His name is Audio. He just came out to me and said he was gay. I don't care. I'm not gay at all. So I don't care that I don't care that he sucks dick. That's his choice. I'm all about the women. So next week, I have 2 videos I'm debating on. And thanks, and for the people that commented, thank you. Except for Audio, he doesn't count. So next week I have 2 videos. I'm gonna tell you which the names of them are. I'm thinking about doing a video on Alfred Packer or the Donner Reed Party, the Donner Party. Those are my 2 videos for next week. I'm gonna get something to eat because I am hungry. I am not gay at all. I'm all about the women. And for one, I went to a party yesterday where I talked to women yesterday. So no, I'm not gay at all. Audio's gay. Audio's okay. So Audio, we know. Okay, so we know you like dick instead of pussy. I don't care that you suck dick for a living. That's your choice. So next week we got Donner Party or Alfred Packer for videos. Alfred Packer was a cannibal. Which means he killed people and ate their body for a living, which is kind of gross in itself. But that's what he admitted to doing. The Donner Party did the same thing, similar basically, when they got trapped in a snowstorm. So I'll see you guys next week, and I hope you guys enjoyed. And anytime the gay homo Audio comes on, we can ignore him. And thanks for tuning in.